All right, I'm back, everybody. Did you miss me? I've been gone for a few hours. By a quick show of hands, do we have any EV owners in the room? All right, good. So this next panel's for you then. See, we have some charging infrastructure questions already. See, our next session's going to be great. So our next session is entitled EV Reality with a Fragile Grid. And moderating this session for us today is the one and only Ernie Lewis from Bridgewater Consulting. Please welcome him to the stage.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Test and test. There we go. That's the one I wanted. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much. I like to make sure I have a little bit of engagement right off the bat. Great to be here with you. We have some great panelists with us right now. I'm going to ask them to come on up, and they're actually going to introduce themselves. I think that's better than me trying to do it. So we'll have Lisa, Wally, and Andy come on up, grab a seat, and we're going to dive right on in. Everybody comfy? All right, good deal. So why don't we just do some quick intros. We'll start with Lisa, work our way back here, and then we'll jump right into the questions.
Thanks, Ernie. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lisa Arellanes. I am an eMobility Senior Manager at Southern California Edison. Been with Southern California Edison and working in the utility business since 2008, and been working on our EV pilots and programs since 2016. So pleasure to be here.
Great.
Hi, I'm Andy Vesey, and I'm going to do this in a way that should qualify me for this panel. So I am the former CEO of Pacific Gas and Electric Company, only during the period of their last bankruptcy. I didn't cause it, but I came in to run the company. I have been the CEO and Managing Director of the largest gentailer in Australia with 4.2 million electric and gas customers that I had to win every day. I was the COO of the AES Corporation, which is one of the largest independent power producers in the world. But my biggest honor was being part of the SmarteMobility subsidiary that Deepak created, a subsidiary of SEW. And I'm here in that role because I advise him still, and it's an extremely exciting thing. So I'll leave it there for the moment.
Thank you.
And I'm Wally Hunter, Managing Director at EnerTech Capital. We are a venture capital firm focused on the energy technology space, been around since 1996. We actually came out of an electric utility called Atlantic Energy. Scott Unger, our founder, ran the deregulated power business at Atlantic and then eventually formed EnerTech out of that. We've managed about $500 million in capital across a number of areas in the energy space, including mobility, a long history with corporate strategic limited partner investors. A number of them are here today, including Electra, SMUD, and SEW, and we form strong partnerships with those strategics as we look at investing in technology companies in the mobility space. So our latest focus is on mobility. We've got a partnership as well with the California Mobility Center as part of that.
Great. Thank you all very much. As was mentioned, my name is Ernie Lewis. I'm with Bridgewater Consulting. I've been in the industry for about 39 years. If you want to know more details about that, talk to me outside. Let's dive in, shall we? So in a recent Department of Energy article, there were three key messages that I think are relevant to our topic that I just want to share as we begin. The first key message and presumption is that energy and water systems are interdependent. Number two, we cannot assume the future is like the past in terms of climate technology and the evolving decision landscape. And number three, water scarcity, variability, and uncertainty are becoming more prominent, potentially leading to vulnerabilities in the U.S. energy system. And of course, based upon the topic we've been given, there is a presumption that our grid is fragile and that will be amplified by the continued advent of electric vehicles. In addition, we've been asked to talk about the nexus between water and energy. We're going to strive to do all that in a very brief amount of time. Our first question we're going to pose to our panelists is, number one, do you agree that our grid is fragile and it will be impacted by electric vehicles? We're going to start with Lisa, and then we'll go from there.
So is the grid fragile? I'm going to say no. How many in the room are from California? Okay, good majority, but some of you are from out of state, and probably the ones that are out of state saw the memes about, our heat waves and electric vehicles, et cetera. We've seen those too. But I want to tell a story about that. In September, we had flex alerts, we had huge demand, and we were doing everything we could to avoid rotating outages here in the state. So something really interesting we saw. Right now, EVs are about 0.4% of the load on our grid here. And we did ask customers, we've been hearing about time of use rates, demand response programs, base interruptible programs for the large industrial customers, deploying everything we could, right, to get voluntary load reductions so we didn't have to use rolling blackouts. So right behind our large industrial customers dropping their load and our summer discount program that cycles customers' air conditioners off were our EV customers who had a 20% shift in their load. That's tremendous. And so I think that's a good way to set up, at least how I would frame this topic, is that's an opportunity. By 2030, that EV load should be about 10% of what's on the grid. But that's more opportunity for us there. It's a flexible load, and I think that's the key to many of those questions or issues sort of posed in the question.
Okay, well, I'm gonna sort of echo the answer. No, the grid's not fragile. The electric grid in the U.S., North America, is the envy of the world. I mean, it is just an amazing machine, and the level of reliability that it produces is just unimaginably high. Now, that said, the perception of fragility comes from the changing environment around these systems that were built. I had the pleasure of joining Pacific Gas and Electric in the middle of a fire season, the type of wildfires that bankrupted the company. And I needed to manage that. I need to prepare for the next one. And that's just an example of why we perceive this grid as fragile, because we built infrastructure in a world that no longer exists. And that's a climate change issue. So that's one dimension. But where I'll bring a challenge is, while EVs don't present a problem today, if we have every vehicle on the road being electric, there's 275 million vehicles. The amount of grid that will have to be built in time to keep up with that is significant. So the issue of fragility that I'd like you to think about is really who's going to pay for that, the equity issues around that. We have many people who live in chronic or episodic energy poverty today who can't afford bills today. When you think about the people who will be first adopters with electric vehicle, who's going to pay for the infrastructure that has to be added to do that? That's an issue of fragility broadly. And hopefully I'll come back to some issues and how I think about it, but that's my opening sort of perspective on this.
Yeah, and I'm going to take a slightly different tack to it, because as a venture investor, we look for opportunities in evolving technologies that will help the grid and help some of the fragility issues that could develop as you add more things to the edge of the grid network. And I think earlier this morning you heard from both SMUD and you heard from Electra on how they're getting their customer to engage more around how they manage energy at the edge of the grid. As you start to add more and more things to the grid network, including electric vehicles, it's the data and the management of those assets that you need to become more efficient at. Otherwise, you do have a fragile grid, and you can't, deal with the number of electrons you need to get to a particular location. And one of the ones I will cite is large-scale, charging networks, becoming bidirectional and using that as a distributed energy resource asset for the utility. Those are all things that require software, intelligence, and data around them in order for them to function correctly, so that Electra's not, walking in there saying, okay, we got to put a whole new transformer in on this street because you just put 100 cars to be charged, and try to plan that a little more efficiently with the customer. So the customer and the utility need to engage. So from a venture perspective, that's where we see business models of companies that will develop around creating that efficiency on the grid, making it less fragile when you start to add more of these assets to it. So
We're going to make you very wealthy with all those things.
All right, that's great. Let me add a little more flavor to the question. One of the things that we were talking about is how is this world affected from a system planning standpoint, right? So if we presume that the grid itself is not fragile, what about long-term system planning as a result of some of these type of diverse energy sources? And I'll just make it a pop-up question. Whoever would like to take it first.
Well, let me pick up because I think it's a good follow-on from the previous comment. When you think about the grid, and we'll talk about planning, but just think about this, that there's a premise that if we electrify everything as our way to avoid a climate disaster, we electrify everything and use green sources, you'd have to build 3 more grids. That's how much load you're going to add. That comes back to my initial question about fragility, but let's go to what Wally said, okay? Think about the system today. You basically have a factory that if it's thermal, throws out 70% of the raw materials. If it's solar, it throws out 90% of the raw materials. You have a long-distance transmission system to market, 7% of your product falls off the truck. And then you have a local distribution fleet that's only used 50% of the time. What a business. What a wasteful business. So how do you improve that business? Through information. Now, we'll stay away from the generation of your product, unless you want to get into some theoretical conversations about Maxwell's demon or other things. But the fact of the matter is that informating the system allows you to get better usage out of it, so you can avoid massive capital investment. Then you get to the question about system planning, right? How do you plan that system, not only to have a great insight into your assets, but as we've heard over the last 2 days, in the way those assets are used, and how do you manage the use to match the need to fully utilize the assets that are already in place? I think that's at the sort of the crux of this issue.
Okay, great. Let me go to Lisa, ask her for a comment on this one.
Yeah, I think what we would seek is a little greater flexibility and ability to plan not according to trend, but actually where we expect the market to go, and not have to wait for approval, if you will, on new regulation, and then be able to build it. We've got to build this a little more quickly. Now, information is the key. We got to know exactly where that load is coming. It really is. It comes down to the distribution level. It's very site specific when you get to, let's say, a large fleet of electric vehicles, especially if they're medium heavy duty vehicles coming into one location. There may be a challenge. Now, again, I think having more flexibility to do that planning earlier. We're always seeking that information. But even in the worst case, let's say, at the distribution level, at the site, we don't have the assets there to be able to serve and charge that load immediately. It takes a year, maybe it takes a year and a half. And in the long scheme of things, that really isn't that bad. We're going towards this electric future. We are trying to combat climate change. Personally, we do think that this is the most efficient and cost-effective way to do it, to meet our greenhouse gas goals and do it effectively. So, again, it's at the distribution level where we have the challenge, but we have a number of things underway to try to get better information. We're working with OEMs. We're doing, I've got a number of initiatives to get that better information so that we can really have this infrastructure available at the site when we need it. It's a challenge, but nothing we can't.
Yeah, and I'll just make a real quick comment on it because we're seeing companies that are helping the utility address this grid intelligence issue. They're looking at it as a way in which they can generate revenue both from the utility and the customer to provide data and information around what those assets are. And that vehicle to grid, vehicle to everything, the telecom companies are going to move into this space and are going to be partners with the utility. You're going to be able to get that grid intelligence without the utility having to make all of the planning on their own, because others will provide some of that connectivity, we believe, from an investment point of view.
Can I just add one thing to that? Because we say system planning, and when I started in this industry in 1978, I knew what that meant because I was a system planning engineer, right? The idea that we think about planning is sort of an old concept, right? We could look at AI for pattern recognition, for commerce, for things that are happening, and the more information we have, it's almost real-time planning to give information to direct. There's so much technology out there that should give us insights that it should be almost an automatic part of the process, right? So we don't have to sort of do those, year-long planning studies, that we can know what we have to monitor, that we can set up the monitoring systems, that we can basically get real-time input into the needs of our system. So there's a huge technological capability that we have to take advantage of if we don't want to have a fragile grid.
All right, very good. By the way, we're going to do something a little different. Rather than wait till the end to ask for questions, we're going to pause in between discussion points, and if there are questions from the audience, we'd like to hear from you at that time. I think it'll make for a richer discussion. One thing I will say, though, as we kind of move from this to the next set of questions, is what we've concluded, as you hear, is that it's not fragile, but there are other pieces around it, but the other part also speaks to investment. And I think that does become a dependency, of which there are a number of dependencies that we have to think about. So, number one, are there any questions from the audience on anything we've covered so far? And if not, we'll move on, but if so, we'll take one. Yes, in the far back. I got 3 already, I love it. Yes.
Stations. I think I'm loud enough. Oh, sorry. Well, my question was, has anyone on the panel thought about potential solutions to the distribution level challenges that you've identified through such other means, such as microgrids, which would combine solar storage to address maybe the load at the customer site, whether that's school buses, municipal buses, commercial vehicles like FedEx, UPS type of charging facilities.
Okay, let's start with Lisa, if you don't mind. This comes from a utility. Oh, is she going to punt? All right, then we're going to punt.
Yeah, I was just going to say, because it's topical, we just had a very successful exit on a company called Tangent Energy Solutions. We sold it to Caterpillar. They are focused on microgrid, for C&I customers. So they're going in on site, putting 40, 50 megawatts of on-site generation. Their software optimizes which of those assets to use at what time of day based on real-time power pricing. So that model, big companies now like Caterpillar see it, and that's why they bought Tangent. And I think that market is going to become even a higher growth market going forward as energy costs continue to fluctuate the way they are currently. But I think that's a great investment area too.
Yeah, look, and I think that I am convinced that has to be part of the solution. The real question that becomes, and this is really almost right back to you, is how do we deal with the question of the investment, typical rate making? We need a lot of innovation there as well, the tariff. Perfect. So I think that's real, but I also want to introduce something else, is that we think about the inevitability of electric vehicles, right? And electric buses and electric Class 8 trucks. When you take electric vehicles to scale, there are a lot of issues, okay? Remember, 275 million vehicles, really what happens to supply chains and the environmental impact. There are alternate fuels. Now, what I didn't say is currently I work for a company that produces green hydrogen. And we're really big into hydrogen for mobility. Well, when you think about hydrogen, then you can bring that into your mix as well, and bringing in an alternate source that takes pressure off electricity has to be thought of, right? We can't be one-dimensional in this.
All right, great. I saw 2 other hands as well. Let me go to my far left.
Lincoln Blevins from Stanford University. I'm curious if, through this discussion, whether we're making an implicit assumption about the demand side of the problem, in that maybe this question is a temporary question to the extent that battery technology continues to advance and we start charging our cars in the way we currently put gasoline in our cars. Does that take a lot of this away as a vulnerability to the extent that we're not charging very much and we're not charging very often, even though you have greater volume? Are we looking at this too statically from the technology side on the EVs?
Yeah, let me start real quickly. I think that the EV part of this is a proxy for electrification, right? Everything that has to be electrified. Because if we think about this as the way to deal with the climate challenge, which I believe is real, and is impacting us now. Somebody didn't like that comment. Okay, better. So the question becomes, if you really believe that in order to get to not a net zero, I don't buy net zero. If it ain't real zero, don't do it. To get to zero, you really have to build up your renewable resources and then electrify everything you can. And what you can't electrify, supply hydrogen for, okay? So take EVs as a proxy. The increasing load challenges the existing grid for all the reasons we said. And yes, things will become more efficient. But when you think about the economic growth and the growth of all the economies, it still remains a challenge. How are you going to serve all these electric loads and do it in a way which is equitable? So the challenge remains the same. So I would use EVs as a proxy, although they're the first one coming down the pike.
Okay, we're going to pause here because I'm watching the clock as well. All right, don't worry, we'll again have time for more questions coming down. So let me shift slightly. The other part of our discussion is around the nexus between water and energy. So the first question we're going to pose to our panelists is, number one, what is the nexus between them, and why should we care? I see Lisa poised with her microphone. We'll start there.
For the
then we'll
last
bounce
question.
back over to Wally, then we'll come back to Andy. Do it that way.
Well, I thought the last question was a good one, and if I can, just address that quickly. But
Yeah, you can do that too.
there's again a world of opportunity. I think we're really in pilot phase still when it comes to vehicle to building or vehicle to home, but that's extra resiliency for you there, and then certainly in vehicle to grid, and so in vehicle to home, you need a lot of customer education. I mean, even just buying and owning an EV or a battery storage or solar at your house, how many hours do you spend on the research? And a lot of customers don't care to spend all that time on that education. But vehicle to home, education and investment on their part, and then vehicle to grid, gonna be attractive to a smaller group of customers, but we still have to figure out, like, what's the market, what's the mechanism, how do we pay them, how much do we pay them, how do we do that? So again, I think we're still in pilot phases to test and learn about all the opportunities that we have with these various technologies, but our point of view is in our Pathway 2045 and our Mind the Gap white papers is that electrification is the way to go to help us achieve those greenhouse gas reductions, and overall it will be a smaller share of wallet in terms of energy in total for our customers as we do this, as we make this shift. So.
All right, great. All right, then let's move to the other question.
Water.
Yes.
Yeah, all right,
So what is the nexus between the two, and why should we care?
Well, really quickly, the nexus is you need both to live. Okay, so that's essential. We have to think of them together. We know that over the last 100 years, that the consumption of water has increased at twice the rate of population. So we know it's not because we're drinking more or we're using it personally. We use it for other things. We use a lot to produce energy, a lot. So what doesn't use a lot of it? The massive shift to renewables, because they don't use water. And the other thing, why is this important, is because water patterns are changing through climate change again. You have no water in places where you had a lot, and you may have a lot where you never needed it before. So the question about the nexus between energy and water is that we have to manage both very efficiently. And one way to do it immediately is to continue to promote this shift away from the steam cycles and other things that are consuming tremendous amount of water. And you can do that by the shift to renewables, as we said before. And then if you look at hydrogen-based technology, you consume water, but after you use the hydrogen, you basically are net even. You produce as much again. So thinking about this becomes important because what we are seeing is that we have built large population centers in places where there is less and less water based on shifting patterns of the climate. So we have to be attentive to both of these issues.
Yeah, we sort of look at the nexus. When you look at the assets that are out there pumping water, you're going to need power for. So the redundancy, because it's an asset that you need to control carefully, the redundancy of those pumps can be used for demand response and controlling assets around system regulation for the utility. So we see as them interconnected that way. We also see, to your point on hydrogen, you're producing hydrogen with water and electrolysis, and you've got to get an energy source in order to do that. So NJR, who you probably all know, the gas company, is doing an electrolysis project right now where they're taking their solar farms and producing the hydrogen and then injecting it back in the pipeline as part of their ESG strategy. So there's a direct electrification of everything that's going on, and water is included.
So I would offer, as we're listening to these responses, that there's an underlying point around timing, right? That if we all had a magic wand today, and we'll come back to magic wand questions in a moment, right, we would do things certainly differently. But now, given where we are, certain things have to evolve. Even when we think about water dependency for the energy that has to actually be produced. So that's the thing that we continue to see. We definitely want to think about that and understand how can we accelerate some of those things. I think that will make a difference as well. In terms of the why should we care, I think we've heard some of that. Yesterday, at some of the sessions that I listened to, there was an interesting discussion about this as well. One of the points that was made was that water consumes a significant portion of an energy company's load. And so the presumption that was being offered was that they should therefore do joint long-term planning together, whereas today that doesn't necessarily happen, right? So I'm curious, panel, whether or not you agree that there should be joint planning between water and energy companies, or do we think that might not quite be necessary?
I would agree. Always sounds like a good idea, right? To align. We hold water conferences at our facilities here in Southern California, and work very close with those partners because water does consume a lot of energy, and vice versa, as we heard. But again, if we want to take advantage of those efficiencies, we want to do that long-term planning together. We're only an electric utility, so we don't have a water utility under our umbrella like some others do, but that's just what I'd offer.
Yeah, look, I agree that we're at a stage where it has to be, the system is what has to be managed, right? It's load, it's serving the load, but how do you do that? And again, I go away from the sort of the planning thing because that sounds very old to me. You just heard a panel, and it was called time of use rates and how it's going to do this. And I said to myself, boy, that's so 1980s. It's really dynamic pricing, right? And the fact of the matter is, what are the most efficient way for people to make investments and respond? It's markets. It's markets with price signals that are real. And so you don't have to manually plan. You have to have markets that send correct price signals at the real time, give people the technology to be able to respond to it, and do that in a very dynamic fashion. That's how we sort that, whether it's water loads, which could be big, not so much in the U.S. utilities, but in places like India and other places where it is very a significant part of load. But it's like everything else. Price signals and giving people the technology to respond in efficient markets is the way that happens, in my mind, dynamically and in real time.
And making it almost invisible to the customer, so they don't have to think about it.
So I understand that at some point in time, but I guess, and maybe it's interesting to be somewhat contrarian with the panelists, but I guess I want to kind of ask a question and ask you to kind of, explain a little bit further. Are you suggesting that there's no need for planning, considering the size, scope, and scale of the infrastructure required to service the millions of customers? I don't think you are, but I just want to make sure I understand your point.
I am.
So
we don't plan this economy, one of the greatest economies in the world. We don't plan it.
Right, but
let's go on. You challenge, so I'm going to respond. What makes this economy work in a Keynesian way is that great invisible hand of markets, right? Planned economies don't work. And I would suggest that what makes the economy efficient is the same thing that will make this efficient. It's supply and demand. And the fact is, having efficient markets that send good price signals where people can make their investments and react based on their own maximization of whatever they want to maximize from that price, I actually believe that's the way to do it. You wanted to have controversy, now you got it.
All right, let me open it up to the audience, because I see all kinds. I love to read the room, right? Thank you very much for going along with me on that, by the way. I expected that's great. Let's take some questions, thoughts, and comments. I see my friend here first, and then we'll go around the room. Gotcha.
Sharif Abade with Varuna, and efficient markets. I went to the school of efficient markets, and we're starting to admit it doesn't quite work. We end up with inequities is sort of what we're learning from that. But I think the question, and I love your comments, is that we talk a lot about the future state we want to get to. What are we doing now? There's this transition point that I don't think the water industry is definitely not as prepared, but the energy industry is maybe a bit further along. But what is going on, EVs as an example, to get us from here to this future state we keep talking about? Because I'll leave it there if you have comments here.
Yeah, I mean, from a technology point of view, a lot of these technologies transcend, whether it's a water utility or electric utility, they can be used in both to create efficiency. So the addition, as I said earlier, of EVs becomes part of the assets that the utility can use to create those efficiencies. They know if they know where the assets are, they know when they're charging, and they can aggregate those loads and have bi-directional charging. That is part of what's going to create that efficiency. And the water companies have the ability to plan around some of these things as well. So, from a venture perspective, the biggest issue we have is just the timing for utilities, and water utilities or electric utilities don't move particularly fast. And if you're an investor in a venture company that's dealing with a utility, you can expect that they're going to trial it for a long time before it's going to be a viable product. And that's the main.
Yeah, we see our role as a natural infrastructure provider, and you obviously need that. We obviously need the infrastructure to charge electric vehicles. For the past several years, we've been doing pilots and programs to help put in charging infrastructure for both light-duty vehicles, regular passenger cars, and medium heavy-duty vehicles throughout our service area, and now we're scaling up to put in a whole lot more of that. But we need a lot more investment that's focused and targeted on disadvantaged communities, low-income communities, because it's easy for someone at their home to plug in their vehicle. This technology is usually attractive to folks that have more disposable income. And we need to continue to make that available and really focus that continued investments in those communities where it's really, really needed. And so I just wanted to jump in real quick and add that.
And so, but let me respond, because I think some was pointed right at me. I agree with you. I'm not talking about free market economies without guardrails. We have to have, and we get that. But to your point, the last day and a half, we've been talking about exactly the answer to that question. Granularity and availability and transparency of data, right? The more granular we get, the more people like Wally can invest in people who have solutions, because by seeing the better data, it gives you a way to capture that and monetize it, right? When you're at a high level, not so much. But everything that we've been talking about, transparency of data, availability of data, the ability to analyze it quickly, to build smart systems around it, the technologists will come to it, right? And they'll find ways of exploiting it. We're still living in a world where we issue annual reports and quarterly reports. Why? Because it used to take accountants that long to do it, right? You could have instantaneous financial data if you wanted it. So the shift in sort of timeline and quantums, this whole conference, everything that SEW is doing is about providing that granularity that people can act on. And GridX just talked about what's on time of use. So the answer to your question was right here in this room, right? And it just takes people to make investments to act on it. And that's how people like Wally, who invest in ventures, bring that to fruition.
Great. So I think what we can see is that it's not a zero sum, right? It is a hybrid. It is the transition. I saw one more question here, and then we'll throw one more to the panel. Oh, I see one more. Okay, one here, one there, and then back to the panel. Yeah, we have about 6 minutes to go. Great discussion.
Well, I appreciate the discussion, and I think some of the clarification I got was with your question. Because in theory, in a classroom, market-driven forces, correct. Reality, not so much. But I think that was addressed. And when you talked about granular data, my pushback was going to be, look, let's be honest. Most Americans are dumb, lazy people that aren't going to get off their butts to change a thermostat or react because they say, oh, I just got an alert, prices are going up, I better do something. Now, if you say, okay, I'm going to provide that granular data so that people like Wally can invest in technology so that, to your point, people don't have to think about it or get off their butts, then maybe it'll work, right? But until we get to that point where people have that trust, I think we have to keep solutioning. The other thing I wanted to challenge that I think I did hear addressed as well was this whole conversation was set up based on the fact that we have to solve what I agree with is electrification with a fragile grid. Why do we have to do it with poles? Why are we still thinking poles and wires and transformers and things like that? But I heard that addressed with, thank you, the microgrids replied. Okay. But I want to hear more about those kinds of ideas outside of poles and wires. No offense, utility people.
Absolutely.
I know that's
maybe
a
I'll
case.
take that one first. And just from an investment perspective, the customer, the prosumer is starting to take control of their own energy needs within their home and within their business. And just to give a shout out to what SEW is doing, having that trusted relationship with the utility, to your point, why is the guy going to move his thermostat up and down? It's because he's got an app on his phone that's telling him that he's got the opportunity to save some money. And that's what I think SEW is doing with a lot of their products that they offer to the utility, will move that customer more quickly to where you're talking about.
Yeah, and a quick response. One is that when I ran a retail electricity and gas business, 4.2 million meter points. I don't tell you how many customers, you can multiply it by 4, all right? That's a lot of people. The only thing they were really interested in was price, period, okay? To get a price that worked for them. And about 20% of the Australian, this was an Australian market, churned for a penny, right? So the question is, everybody makes a rational decision. The reason you don't get up to move your thermostat is because whatever you're doing at the moment is more valuable to you than standing up and doing that, okay? Unless you have a different view, but usually you're making a rational decision. So you can call it lazy, I just call it rational. If it's not worth your while, you're not gonna do it. The other point on poles and wires, electricity is a network business. You don't have a network, everybody pays more. Why? Because you have to aggregate the load to get the lowest price. But there is a combination about that network and how to get the maximum value out of it. So the fact of the matter is, having connected customers has tremendous value. What is it? A square of the number, every time you add somebody, the value goes up? I think that's right, given the load diversity. So I think there will always be poles and wires. We will look at microgrids, but they will not be fully disconnected from the grid because you'll lose value. So yeah, I think there's good questions, but that would be the way I would respond to you.
Great. Let's take one more question from the audience, and then we'll get ready to wrap up.
Thank you all for a great discussion. Obviously we know, or we can assume load's coming, right? We see electrification, we see the investments from the OEMs, we see, you can read the tea leaves, right? And from a utility planning perspective, they have to look at what's available now, right? It's hard to war game or kind of assume what's going to happen in the future. So I think that's what makes it so difficult to plan, is this is so dynamic, it's moving so fast, and there's a lot of emerging technologies, a lot of investment. What are your thoughts? And I've heard microgrids, and I've heard, the utility perspective, these great infrastructure projects to prepare the grid for what's coming. But if you wargame or think about, behind the meter storage and solar, what if the cost of solar was half what it is right now? What if the cost of battery storage was half what it is right now? How does that change the dynamic? I mean, now we're looking at, really, you've got generation at the house level, the home level. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, unless you got to zero cost storage and zero cost energy, the change in load patterns always will give you a value up to some point. Now, you're right. If it gets to such a low point that the cost of connection, of additional connection, doesn't make sense, you got it. But that is probably the only way you get away from the network economics, because everybody's loaded at any given point in time, right? So that the value of the last electron consumed by any user is different at any given point in time, which means there's always the ability for arbitrage of that last electron, right? So you want the ability to sell that last electron to your neighbor if he wants to watch the Super Bowl and you were just going to do your laundry, right? You can sell that, and that's the Pareto optimal electric system, where there's arbitrage at the end user point, right? So to the degree that you have different demands or different values, there's always the opportunity to trade. And by trading, you'll get the lowest cost system no matter who owns the components and no matter what the cost, unless everything's free. I think that's where it breaks down.
Yeah, but I think that model's changing too. In Ontario, Electra knows this well. The global adjustment charge that was implemented there put a lot of commercial industrial players to the point they had to microgrid. They want to go off the grid. So Electra doesn't mind owning that mini power plant that's sitting on that customer's property now. It's another generating asset that they can use in their system. So I think the model for microgrids is going to be a big part of what the customer is going to demand, because they don't want to pay the high prices. We've got Caterpillar going over to Europe to equip one of the big auto OEM players with several of their plants to have storage, solar, off-grid type assets that they wouldn't have done before, but the power pricing in Europe is so high on nat gas that they have to.
And I would probably argue, we're out of time, can't
Yeah, we
argue,
are out of
sorry.
time. All right, listen, I thank you all very much for an extremely engaging conversation. The red light is blinking. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your time.